So we are live streaming for those of you who have friends who are stuck in the office. And as is the norm for these sorts of things, we're going to be a little bit informal. My name is Wayne Burke. I run a nonprofit here in DC. The echo's a little hard to talk through. We focus on citizen engagement. So we do a lot of work with government agencies, trying to bring government employees in contact with people from civil society, private sector, experts in different areas. I've been using open source for a long time, so I love the fact that I get to merge the two and do something around these sorts of events. So we have a pretty cool group of things signed up today. Pretty impressive list of speakers. I think some really innovative and interesting discussions that will happen right here. This building, who's the first time coming here? NYU DC. Yeah, I kind of thought so. I noticed when you go to Street View, there's actually a cement mixer in this location. So they were incredibly generous to let us use the space, been incredibly helpful in setting everything up. And it sounds like the Wi-Fi is actually working, which if anyone has been to a lot of tech conferences, that seems to be an exception to the rule. So we're actually going to start the official speakers at about 9 o'clock. And prior to that, I want to thank the names that are up here on the screen, which actually made it so we're not just all doing this as a volunteer effort. Hortonworks, Kitware, Esri, Second Muse, and I believe there's people from each of those here in the room, so you can keep an eye out for them. So today, and actually let me just bring this up, and I apologize because it's a little weird to be looking sideways as I'm doing this. So if you haven't found it, from the homepage, ossummit.org, there's a link to this page. And this is HackPad. So how many people have worked with HackPad before? Okay, not a lot of people. I love using it for this type of thing. It's kind of Google Docs-y in a way because it allows simultaneous editing by multiple people. Google Docs actually tops out at about 50 people. This tops out about 150 people, so for events it's a lot more useful. For those of you who are, actual geeks that do coding, and I mean that in the most respectful of senses, it actually does code highlighting also, so you could have 150 people editing the same code base simultaneously in a productive way, which is pretty cool. What I like about it, obviously, Wi-Fi passwords. I have the whole agenda brought in here as well. So here's what we'll be doing in the morning to get things started. And what I want to point out, as you listen to these speakers, and as you listen to the agency vignette talking about the problem this morning that Census is dealing with and getting advice on that, take notes in the HackPad. You'll see right at the top it says, link to take notes and provide advice. So we try to be pretty obvious about what we're doing with these things. You click through there, take notes. What we'll be doing at the end of the event is taking all those notes and putting them into probably an online archive as well as a downloadable resource so that people who aren't actually here can actually benefit from what went on here. So we're trying to have a really engaging discussion around what it means to build community within an open source context, and then be able to spread the information that we glean from here to the broader government community. So after that, and as you're listening, you're taking notes, you're capturing information, and when we get to Engaging America here, the census discussion, we won't actually have like a question and answer interaction period with the audience during these, but you can add information, especially any advice you may have for Census on the problem that they're dealing with, add it into the HackPad. because they can take that back, they can analyze it, provide links to information, case studies. If you have something helpful, you want to do a follow-up conversation, feel free to propose that. The idea is we don't just want the experts who are sitting in the front of the room, but also the experts that are sitting in the audience to have a place to provide that information and follow up. And then that, of course, will become part of the archive afterwards also that other people can leverage for whatever it is that they're working on. So in addition to all of that, when we get done with the agency vignette, there are 2 participant problem-solving sessions. And I understand that coming here, some of you may have not known what that meant. How many people here have been to an unconference? Okay, about half the room. So basically, we're going to be doing sort of a mini unconference around each of the 3 topics that we're discussing over the 2 days. What that means is, if you came here with a specific issue relevant to the topic, put it in one of these rooms. We have 12 or 13 spaces. Whatever discussion you want to have, it may be that you hear something that a speaker says, but they don't go in depth enough. Feel free to go up to the speaker afterwards and say, hey, I want to have a discussion about that. I've already put it in the hackpad. It's in room B101 at 10:30. Please come to that session. And so you can get more in depth about the things that will be specifically helpful to you when you get back to work either tomorrow or Thursday. Does that all make sense? Pianos?
Are we all going to be parallel, or are we...
Question is, will they all be in parallel? There are actually 2 time slots in each of the 3 topics, and I'll touch on the topics here in a moment. So this is the 10:30 time slot. You scroll down a little farther, you see there's an 11:30 time slot, and I believe those rooms have actually filled in at this point, although I see the version I'm displaying hasn't updated. Does that answer the question? Yeah. So just to cover the topics, we're opening this morning with a broad discussion of open source communities. And I'll be introducing the speakers here in a moment, so I'll wait to get back to that. This afternoon, we'll be discussing the complexities around converting a closed community to open. To expand on that a little bit, of course, there is a lot of software that's developed inside government, and the issue that came up in discussion with the planning team was, how do you take that closed development community that has existed perhaps for 20 years and move that to an open source community? Of course, there's a lot of culture change complexity. There's a lot of other things that go along with that. So the afternoon we'll be discussing that. And then tomorrow morning, we'll be discussing creating a new community. So you want to develop a new software project, or you already have the foundation laid, you want to build a community around that. That's what this discussion is specifically relates to. And then the afternoon tomorrow is, we know that even though the planning team was drawn from 11 or 12 different agencies, there's no way we can actually know all of the issues that you're dealing with. So we have asked all of the experts, all the speakers who are coming here, to spend as much time as they can here. Of course, schedules being what they are. Tomorrow afternoon, and I apologize, someone is editing the document. Very nice. Tomorrow afternoon is an open discussion. So any discussion that you want to have that doesn't quite fit into the other 3 topics, feel free to put it in one of these slots. Any questions on that? I know the first time we go through that, it's a little bit confusing. I want to make sure everyone understands. Easy. The next thing I want to say is, unlike a traditional event, and even though there's a slight delay between what I say and what I hear back to me, which is a little confusing, and I apologize to the speakers who will have to deal with that also, this event is about you. It feels very formal right now in this setting with the microphone echoing around, but you can probably tell I didn't exactly dress to go to Capitol Hill today, and most of you didn't either. So this event is really about getting answers to questions that you have that will actually help you do your work better. And the more you take responsibility for that, actually, let me tell a little story. I did an event a couple of years ago called Congress Camp. It was about use of social media on the Hill for citizen engagement. And the best session that happened at that event was a brand new Hill staffer who was in charge of communications for a Senate office. And he literally, 15 minutes, 100 people in the room, and generally speaking, anyone who works for government is not very open in terms of wanting to express what they don't know. He comes up to the front of the room and he says, I've been in this position for about 2 months. I have a stack of software this high in the office. What do I do with all this stuff? And 20 people, largely social media experts, sat down with him for an hour and really provided him some tangible advice. And I say this because the best sessions largely are the ones that begin with a question, that begin with the acknowledgement that here's what I need to know or here's what I don't know. And then there are enough people here that have similar experiences, that have helpful information, that can come and help you figure that out. So that's really the goal of the next 2 days. Try to provide you enough context, enough information around open source communities. And I should say, normally we talk about open source, we talk about software, but there are also, of course, people within government who are working on hardware, open source hardware, and open source data. And we could call that open data, but when you call it open data, all the transparency people also show up, and then the conversation shifts to the pros and cons, and give us our data and all this sort of thing. And we wanted to skip over all of that and go straight to, if you're releasing data and you want people to use it, how do you build a community around that? And how do we learn from the open source software people, the open source hardware people, bring all that together and really figure out together how to do some interesting stuff. So with that as an introduction, anyone have any questions, uncertainties? Yes? There is the list on the Eventbrite site. It doesn't have actual contact information. We're fairly cautious about spreading that around, of course. But if there's someone that you want to meet, come to me and I can certainly see if I can facilitate that. Anything else? Yes, the question was, is there a contact list for everyone who's attending? Sorry. Thanks, Logan. Sorry? Someone's making a Twitter list. Awesome. And if you want to just make a resources section on the HackPad, then everyone will have access to it. Also, of course, there is a... Did Safari crash? There is a hashtag for Twitter, which is OSSDC. I encourage you all to tweet, especially because we didn't do a lot of outreach on the live streaming, which I should say NYU is also doing that through their own, and they'll be archiving all the video, and that'll be available on the Ustream channel pretty much immediately. So please, let the world know, let your colleagues know, so they can benefit from this as well. And with that, so what we will do, I will introduce each of the 3 speakers this morning, and then we'll bring them all back up here, and we'll have a discussion with census.gov. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Pieros Papadeas, Community Manager at Mozilla Foundation. Pieros, please, was kind enough to come all the way from Greece. I'm going to say just to speak with us today.
You're a great crowd.
So he's going to talk about open source communities, broadly speaking. You want to go ahead and set up right here. In terms of why people join them, I was saying to him last night that generally speaking, there seems to be this understanding that open source communities are mostly people sitting in their basements that just really love to code. There's just something about the color of amber or black and white that really turns them on. Pieros seems to think there's more to it than that. So as soon as we get the technical stuff set up.
Give me a sec. So quiet in here. It's either you're not caffeinated or you're not excited for the conference itself. So I guess it's just the first, based on what Wayne.
I think that there's something about the sound deadening in here that makes it feel like a library. That's even if people are shuffling around, we don't hear it.
Okay. So do I have two things I have?
Just the one.
Okay.
All good? Do you want to walk or are you going to stay?
I think I'm good here as long as the mic picks me up. And it does. Okay. So good morning, everyone. So my name, as Wayne said, is Pieros Papadeas. I'm a community architect at Mozilla, and you can tweet me at ppapadeas or email me at pieros@mozilla.com. And today we're going to take a view on what motivates people to contribute to open source. And we'll be doing that by examining volunteerism and its relationship with open source. Now, Mozilla's experience for over 15 years in community building can help us articulate those motivations, and it's basically the source of most of the points that we're going to make here today. Now let's talk a bit about volunteerism in general. In their basic nature, open source contributions are a form of volunteerism. As such, they inherit the inner workings of a volunteer contribution system together with their set motivations for participation. There is already an existing extensive literature around volunteerism. Nevertheless, we should go through some basics behind incentivization for volunteers. And we'll start with altruism. One of the basic incentives that drive volunteers can be altruism itself. The sense of selflessness and the urge to help others, most of the time inspired by the mission of the project, is definitely a strong motivation, and one that most of the volunteer projects are trying to build up extensively. Now, altruism cannot be forced, but certainly a well-articulated mission of the project can help you get more engagement around your mission. Another thing is the sense of belonging in a group. Making new friends and having fun can also be strong motivations for volunteers. In general, socializing tends to be underestimated for volunteer groups, but I can assure you that is a huge driving force for many people. And you'll be amazed by seeing how socializing through volunteer groups can get people to be more productive in collaborating with each other. Another aspect is learning and development, which can be a key theme on defining motivations for volunteer projects. Learning new skills, polishing some already existing ones, gaining some work experience, receiving professional training, and even developing leadership skills or trying out new job roles and job positions are things that contributors might be looking into when joining a project. So learning and development is a huge aspect of those. A final point on volunteer motivations would be rewards and recognition. So non-monetary rewards and public recognition through communication channels that the project owns can act as a great token of appreciation from the project to its contributors. A special mention about swag in specific. Many people tend to underestimate the importance of swag and like tokens of appreciation in physical form. I can assure you that they go long ways. A funny note about that is myself, I got involved in open source trying to find a Firefox sticker many years ago. So believe me, the return of investment for kickstarting engagement.
So where's our swag?
Yeah, I brought some with me actually. So yeah, you can get some Mozilla stickers afterwards, that's for sure. So the return of investment is kind of like instantaneously. Especially for the first kickstart of engagement together with a contributor, swag can go a long way. And up until now, like the four themes that we presented covered the basic set of motivations for volunteerism. But what happens in specific with open source contributions? As we said, open source contributions can be considered as a subset of volunteerism, but perhaps most importantly, they can be an extension of it. So what is it that sets apart open source contributions from volunteerism? Most open source projects are cultivated out in the public with participation from all over the world. Their nature enables it. It is virtual, open to everyone, and largely anonymous. A graduate student from Mumbai can easily collaborate for your project with a freelancer in Santiago de Chile. And they can still do that online and feel this diversity and this globalness. So it's this celebration of diversity and global thinking that drives many people to participate in open source projects. This is in contrast to largely how most of the volunteer projects work, which work on predominantly a local level. So global versus local. Another point would be access to data. Due to the nature of many open source projects, detailed and otherwise not available communications and documentations and specifications and data and open source, like source basically of code, needs to be accessible to the prospective contributors. So this access to data intrigues many of them and can act as a great motivation. A point about participatory governance here. When an open source project is deployed as participatory throughout its structure, and this is not mandatory, but many open source projects tend to go that direction, the participatory governance poses as a learning opportunity for people with leadership skills to participate and sign. Being part of a decision-making procedure is fascinating for many contributors. Now, once again, this is kind of like in contrast with what's happening on most volunteer projects, where your goals are kind of set, you already know what you're about to do, you don't have a great say on how things are deployed or how the governance works. So this is a really important point that sets open source apart many times from volunteerism. Open source projects have many times highly specific and exclusive requirements in terms of technical skills from their contributors. Whether it's a specific programming language or a technical skill or a knowledge around deploying a specific software, it can be really exclusive. So sometimes even us, as community builders, have a hard time articulating or even understanding what the project needs. So it's this exclusivity and uniqueness that intrigues many contributors to join a project. Imagine they're highly creative people that want to find someone who is like-minded to collaborate with and work together on a project. So all those motivations that we covered on the volunteer side or on the open source specific side are from a standpoint of an individual, right? A point here is that many open source projects do not have only individuals as contributors, but there are also groups, companies, organizations, foundations, for-profit or non-profit companies that contribute to open source projects. And this happens for different sets of motivations. Of course, the most obvious one is collaboration between different projects and different companies or whatever. But two other points would be that many times this can act as an investment from the contributor side, the company or organization contribution side, towards a specific project, because the return of investment after that would be the usage of it or the deploying or developing of a new technology that they have a say early on. Also, another point is that sometimes the contribution to open source projects can act as a training for the employees or the people within the organization. So many projects tend to be deployed as an investment and pose themselves as the ones that are going to facilitate training for specific companies. One fine example about that is the Linux kernel itself. Here we can see like the top 10 groups of contributors for the Linux kernel, and 7 out of 10 are huge companies. Some final points to consider. Not everything applies to every project. All those motivations, even the volunteer ones or the open source specific ones, can be tailored to fit your project needs. And because the contributors are in constant flux, they're moving around, engaged or disengaged by other projects, moving around projects, or within the project itself, you need to constantly adjust, trial and error, the motivations that you pose for them, the motivations that you communicate, find out what works best, and make sure that you take the best out of it. Thank you for your time. Any
Wonderful.
questions, or we're gonna
We'll
take it.
We'll wrap it up. If you want to go ahead and
Yep.
just take a seat over there. So up next, we have Jim Jagielski. And Jim, I have to say, I love on your LinkedIn profile that you self-represent as the president, director, co-founder, and member of the Apache Software Foundation. So really, they only need you.
No. I need a lot more people.
And Jim will be talking about governance models and how to set them up. This is something that came up on the planning team calls for several different things, and I think Pieros also referenced the importance of governance in setting up an open source community. So, you ready?
I believe in 3 seconds we will be. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, good morning, everyone. As Wayne said, my name is Jim Jagielski. I'm associated with the Apache Software Foundation. We'll be talking today about governance and community, some of the aspects of building a governance model, different types of governance models, as well as how to build communities around it. I do wear a number of different hats to pay the bills because, in general, open source, as was talked about earlier, is a volunteer-based entity. I work for Red Hat, but I also wear a number of different hats in the open source world, including my association with the Apache Software Foundation, with Outer Curve, and of course the OSI, the open source initiative as well. So let's talk about governance and community and what that means in an open source kind of world. Well, basically, when you look at the open source governance models out there and the types of communities, there are basically 3 main types. The first type is what's called a walled garden. And this is the kind of community where, yes, it's open source because it has an open source license associated with it, but it really doesn't have an open and vibrant community based around it. It's really an open source project that's controlled in a large part by a single entity, usually a commercial entity. So a really good example of these would be like MariaDB, for example, or a MySQL. Okay, these are open source projects under an open source license, but the governing body behind that is really a corporate entity. They're the people who have the final say on where these projects go. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the walled garden type of open source model. It really depends on the kind of audience you're trying to pull in and the design aspect associated with the projects that you're talking about. The other type that's very, very popular out there is what's called the benevolent dictator for life. You see these in a lot of entities and organizations, especially languages, where the community itself is very, very vibrant. There's a lot of collaboration and consensus building going on within the community. But there's usually one person who really has the ultimate final say on what is and is not included in the code, where the community goes, the decision-making process. Now, what makes this entity benevolent is the very fact that they don't stick their nose into it a lot of the times. They're basically there sort of like a fallback position. So if there are really, really serious issues going on within the community, okay, the community knows that they have this benevolent dictator who is able to make the final decisions for them. So it's very, very, a very viable process. And obviously, you know, as I said before, languages are a great example of that because they have that singular vision associated with it. But of also, you know, the Linux kernel is probably the most famous example of how this entity works. And it really is useful, a useful way of creating a community and having a governance model. But I think what's very, very important inside this, and the way it is different from the walled garden, is that the benevolent dictator is chosen by the community. They aren't self-assigned. That power, as Dennis says in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, power derives from a mandate from the masses. And that's exactly where the benevolent dictator gets that power. The community decides that that person has the final ability to make these decisions. And the other main governance model or community method is what's called meritocracy. And in this way, it's very, very a flat, even layer of peers out there. Okay, there is no single person who has more authority or less authority than another person. And the reason why this is a very, very, at least in my opinion, a very, very useful model is that it basically forces the community to work together. They don't have that fallback position when somebody can go to make the final decision for them. It really drives them to see themselves as peers and to work together as a community. Also, it's very, very important for them to keep new blood coming in. So meritocracy is a great way of ensuring the continued health and viability of a process. What happens, for example, when the benevolent dictator for life goes away? Decides they're not interested in this project anymore. Well, there's this vacuum there that the community needs to very, very quickly figure out some way to fill. With a meritocratic process, that's not the case because people are always coming and going and stuff like that. Oh, thank you. Now, in addition to the actual governance models themselves, you have to look at the way licenses interact and interface with these community models in there. And there are some governance models which are much more attuned to a specific type of open source license, for example. Now, the most permissive type of license is what's called the give me credit type of license. These are the Apache license, the BSD license, and these work very, very well with the meritocratic process. And basically the idea behind this license is that you can do anything you want to do with the software, just give me credit. Just make sure that people are aware that you got it from Apache, you got it from Outer Curve, you got it from Mozilla, wherever it is you got it from, you just can't claim that it's yours. And as I said before, it's very, very great for meritocratic processes because it keeps that nice, even playing ground for people. The other type is what's called the give me fixes type. And this works great for meritocratic as well as the benevolent dictator for life, and even a little bit of the walled garden. The whole idea behind this is that you take the code and you do what you want to do with it, okay? But if you actually fix the code that I shared with you, you really should give me back those fixes. I don't care what you do with it externally. I don't care what you bundle it with or things like that. But if you fix that code, give it back to me so we can share it with everybody else out there. And again, it's a really powerful way of encouraging feedback from the external user base to the internal community itself. It basically provides a nice way of pulling that interest in. By sort of like saying you have to provide fixes to us, you're kind of like jump-starting the community to get involved. And finally, there's what's called the Give Me Everything, or the GPL type of license out there. And you see these pretty much in a lot of like the walled garden kind of communities. And the reason why is because with this type of license, it's much easier to have a single entity control the direction of the project. Even though it's open source, it really restricts a wide variation of the code out there, and it really enforces this control and the future management of the software project because everything has to be folded back in. Now finally, we'll spend a little bit of time at the very, very end just about some aspects of community building, okay? Now there are a lot of different ways of creating your governance structure. I would not recommend creating your own foundation. It's very, very difficult to do nowadays, especially trying to get nonprofit status. There's a mailing list called a foundations mailing list. A lot of open source foundations are on. And the IRS are really cracking down on nonprofit 501c3, 501c4 entities out there, open source foundations. So the best way to do it is actually go to an existing foundation and work with them to try to get your models out there. But while you actually have your governance structure up, there are some key factors that you need to worry about or consider to ensure you get that community buy-in, that you engage the community. You see too many of these, these dump and run kind of projects out there. Okay, we're going to turn this into open source. We're going to put an open source license with it, plop. And people stand back and they wait for the community to come. And it doesn't happen that way. As was talked about earlier, open source developers have that initiative. They want to be involved. They want to scratch their own itch. And so you need to ensure that the open source project provides that capability. Now, one really great way of doing that, and what we found that in the ASF, the Apache Software Foundation, is using mailing lists. Okay, the problem with things like IRC or other real-time communication factors is that you disenfranchise a large part of your potential community out there. If you're 6 hours away in time zone, you can't interface and interact with the community. So if everybody else is on IRC at the same time and you're like in Australia, and you're going to feel left out. So you're disenfranchising that large part of people out there. Email lists are really, really nice because they're non-synchronous. Okay, people can leave for 6 months, come back on, look over the email archives, and immediately understand what happened, the rationale going on behind it. It provides a nice central, even place for people to share ideas and do development. In fact, at Apache, all of our development, 100% is done on our email lists. If it didn't happen on list, it didn't happen. It's got to be done there. Another thing that's very, very important is to drive consensus. It's very, very important to make sure that people feel engaged and empowered. As much of a buzzword as that is, it's very, very important that people feel empowered to do that. Open source is really the only volunteer effort where you can really make global, worldwide, substantial changes to everything. Okay? So it is by itself a huge draw. Okay? But if people feel as if they're being abused by people using their volunteer efforts to just help a single entity out, then they're going to not worry about that. So try to drive consensus, make sure that people feel empowered to talk and put things in there. A great thing about open source is that the user community and the developer community are very tight. There's a very tight feedback loop behind there. So really encourage a lot of that consensus inside there. And finally, there are people in the open source world known as poisonous people. And these are people who are like great developers, but they drive a wedge in the community. They drive people away. So at that point in time, you have to step back and say, and look at it sort of like as a productivity thing. Yeah, this person is very, very productive, but they're disenfranchising a lot of potential users, a lot of potential developers. We need to talk to this person and make sure that they either, address their ways and get better, or else, ask them to leave the project. So no matter how beneficial someone is, if they're poisonous to the community, you need to really, really address that. And finally, when you think about it, there's really nothing in open source that's any different than what you learned in kindergarten. The basic ideas about open source and open source communities and the governance models associated with healthy, viable open source communities are you play nice, okay? You share. Most importantly, you have fun. You make it a fun place for people to come and do fun stuff, and you'll have a rousing success. Thank you.
Thank you. So will this just switch back? Back to the computer. Next up, we have Vicki Allams come to talk about federal legal and policy issues. I keep having this desire to talk like I'm on a radio show. I think something about the acoustics in here. Thank you. I'm glad that you're all here this evening. It's very nice to have you in the room. I'm going to be playing some slow jazz. Vicki is the Associate General Counsel for Intellectual Property at DISA. That's the Defense Information Systems Agency for anyone who's not from DC. And happy to have you here, Vicki. Oh, I should start your...
Our security issues. And as he's bringing it up, I'll tell you a little about how we got involved in open source. Can you hear me?
Oh, sorry.
About how we got involved in open source software issues, and why I've been doing a lot of speaking on this issue probably since 2009, 2010. How many people are here from government agencies? Oh, actually quite a few. That's great. Okay. How many of you are familiar with CINDY, the Government Copyright Working Group? A couple of people. Okay, that's good. Because actually, thank you. Okay, how do I advance it? Let's see.
Right there.
Right there. Okay, great.
And you're welcome to use that or that one.
Okay, great. Actually, I think I'll use this one. Can you guys hear me if I use this mic? Okay, great. I have a loud speaking voice. It's great to be invited to something like this, especially if you're a lawyer, and especially if you're a government lawyer, and if you're a government lawyer who's been very actively involved in these issues, because I think what we do is people say, oh, you know, the government is very nervous about using open source software, there are lots of issues out there, and actually both of those statements are probably true. And from my perspective, DISA started really looking at using open source software. Of course, Department of Defense had been using open source software probably as far back as 2003 with the MITRE memo I think people are familiar with, if you're familiar with DOD. And then in 2009, we came out with another memo. By that time, I was joining DISA, and my clients were beginning to look at using open source software products that are already on the market, or trying to decide whether we were going to take software that we developed, and my agency develops a lot of software, and put it out there via an open source model. And if we used either of those solutions or options, what kind of issues were presented. And as an attorney, I had come in from the private sector. I had done a fair amount of work with software, but I had never done a lot of work with open source software. And because I was within DOD, of course, that raised a lot of issues. And so what we did, we started to sort of vet those issues, working with the clients. And so you never want to hear a lawyer say you can't do it, right? Nobody wanted me to say you couldn't do this. What they wanted to hear was, yes, we can do it, but tell us what the issues are, tell us what the risks are, and tell us how we work around that. And so that's what we did. And we spent a lot of time doing that. And then in the CINDY Copyright Working Group, and CINDY is a government group of information managers throughout the federal government, both the civilian side and also the Department of Defense. And the CINDY group basically, they were not, most of the government agencies were not really big on using open source software. But when I came to the table, because my client, DTIC, which is the Defense Technical Information Center, is a co-chair of that group, and I said, these are issues that we're dealing with at DISA, and I suspect that other federal agencies are going to start to consider using open source software. There is no checklist out there. You know, there's nothing out there that says, here are the issues that you need to consider if you're using open source software. And so when we put that on the table at the CINDY group, we decided that that was something that we really needed to do. And so we spent about 6 to 7 months. Actually, it was a quick turnaround project for us. And we created this document. And this document is actually listed in the PowerPoint. If you have your computers, you can Google CINDY open source software FAQ, and this will come up. This is really I would say a wonderful checklist for both lawyers, but also people on the development side, people on the program side, in terms of what you have to consider if you want to use open source software, something that's already on the market, or if you want to put out software that has been developed by government employees, or either government employees and contractors, and I'm going to talk about all of that in a minute, because those are some of the issues. This tells you sort of almost on a step-by-step checklist of what you have to do and what you need to be concerned about. Okay, and so that's sort of a general agenda of some of the things I'm going to talk about. Now, there are a lot of agency policies on the use of open source software, and basically they encourage, I think, the use of open source software. The reason they do that is because open source software is commercial software under government legal terminology, and you're encouraged in the acquisition process of considering commercial products, okay? Open source software, commercial product, we got that straight. That was a big issue that we had to really kind of vet, you know, is this commercial or is it not commercial? Where it is. And so all of those policies pretty much say that. DOD's memo is the October 16, 2009 memo. That is a it supersedes the 2003 memo, and it's really comprehensive in terms of our policy in encouraging the use of open source software. It sort of vets all of those issues, the sharing issue, which is an issue. You know, if you use open source software, you make changes to it, do you have to share all of those changes with the entire world? That raises some issues for us because of security. Okay, so that policy memo, I think, addresses those issues very well. Okay, I just said that a minute ago. That's kind of the starting point for use of open source software. So we're at the point where, yes, you can use it. It's a good thing, but there are issues, and that's what you got to look at. Okay, so in terms of the first scenario, it's taking software that has been created within the government or on behalf of the government, and can you put that out via an open source license model? That's a big issue. How many people in this room, people from the government agencies probably know that the government doesn't own copyright in anything created by its employees? Everybody know that? Some people know that, some people don't. Yeah, I know when I came into the government, I've been in and out of government, so I knew it. But because I was on the policy side of intellectual property for a lot of years, coming in on the practice side of it, I tell you, that raises a number of issues in terms of government employees. DISA has a huge agency of people who do nothing but create software. And all of that software that we create, because it's created by government employees for the most part, we don't own the copyright in it. Who owns the copyright in it? Nobody. You know, it's in the public domain because it was created by with taxpayer funds. And so the thought behind that provision in the Copyright Act is that it should be out there. Everybody should be able to use it. You should be able to share it, and it should be open to the public. So it is. Now, if you want to put something out via an open source model, that's probably the easiest type of software. And in fact, DISA has a project. It's a technology transfer project that we work with the Open Source Software Institute down in Mississippi to take software that we had created exclusively by government employees. Nothing secure about this, so no applications involving weaponry or telecommunications that would be sensitive, but administrative stuff, administrative applications created by DISA employees that we thought would be useful if we got it out there to the entire community. Really, anybody out there who wants to use it could use it, and we put it out via an open source license. So that's the first example. That's the easiest example of yes, you can do it. Okay, now, so that's the example I'm talking about, the first one. The second example is tougher because basically you've got a vendor, and most people don't understand this. If somebody creates software for the government, you go out, you retain a company to create a software product for you. When they do that, it depends on the scheme that you work under. Well, we work under the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations for intellectual property and data rights. That's for defense. Civilian agencies work under the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR. And I'm going to use the DFAR as an example because I work for DOD. That's what I'm familiar with. Under the DFAR, if a vendor creates software for us, the vendor owns the copyright in it. We get a license right in it. And it's a complicated area. The license right that we get, the scope of it really depends on whether we funded it, whether it was exclusively funded by the government, whether there's mixed funding, meant they take some of their product that they start from, that's a commercial product, and then they enhance it for the government, whether they deliver it with any restrictions on it when we get it. Okay, let's say it's completely government funded, but they come in and they put restrictions on it, and we don't catch that, then we are limited in terms of whether we can actually license it under an open source model. So it's very, very complicated. The FAR is different because I think under the FAR, the vendor has to assert copyright as the contractor. So that's a different model. I think the defense model is a little more complicated in terms of sort of what kind of licensing rights the government gets in it. Let's say, for example, we paid for it, no restrictions on it, no commercial software in it, completely GOTS, government-created software for us, and we want to put it out via an open source model. we can do that. You typically have an unlimited license right, okay, that says we can modify it, we can share it with others, okay? Or we can get a government purpose license right, typically with mixed funding if there are no restrictions. We can put it out there if we can use it within the government. So those are the really two scenarios that we work with in defense when I'm evaluating whether or not software that has been created for us we can put out there via an open source model. And I've done this. We have a project, the OSEMAS project, which was the first one, but we also have Forge.mil, which some people may be familiar with in the room, and I'm going to talk about that a little at the end. That's exactly those two scenarios. Unlimited license rights or government purpose license rights. So very complicated within the government scheme. It doesn't say you can't put that software out there via an open source model. It just says you've got to know the government's licensing rights in it and what issues are raised. Okay? So, and those are the DFAR clauses that I look to as a lawyer to evaluate whether or not the software can go out there and whether those clauses were in the contract. And I'm sure people who are from the civilian world have your clauses that you're looking at to make sure that those clauses are in the contract. So very complicated issues. Now, we're going to work to commercial software. Let's say the second scenario. There's a software, OSS software product out there, open source, that my clients want to use. And I can tell you this happens all the time. And they come to me and say, we want to use this product. Are there issues with it? So, yes, there are a lot of issues that you got to vet. You've got to look at the licensing terms. There are some pitfalls for using open source software if you're within the government. Can the government live with the licensing terms? So the first thing I say is bring me the license. Let me look at it. What does it say? Share and share alike? Well, depending on if we want to make enhancements to that and it's a security issue, we may not share and share alike. Although our 2009 memo says that if you share it within the government, you're okay. You don't have to share it outside of the government. Never been litigated, so certainly an issue. But in terms of sort of how those licenses actually work, but that's our interpretation of it. So that's an issue that the program people, the developers, and the lawyers all have to work through within the government. Complex issue to live with. Okay, redistribution of the modified code. That's probably one of the biggest issues. The other issue is, does it present a problem for use in classified or other sensitive systems within DoD? Remember, I'm talking from the DoD perspective. If you're an intel agency, you're certainly going to have the same kinds of issues, right? If you're with one of the other agencies and you've got software where there might be issues in terms of being able to put it on your system for some other reasons, you have to be able to vet all of those issues. Okay, the licensing terms, some of the other things we're going to talk about. The big one is maintenance and support. Government have a lot of money these days? No, right? But serious budget constraints. And most of the licenses don't provide a lot of maintenance and support, do they? If you got to pay for that, and that's a cost issue, that's something you got to think about. Okay, if you can handle that in-house, then that's okay. But if you can't, that's an issue you got to think about. Indemnification. Some of the licenses require you to indemnify. Government can't do that. In fact, the Department of Justice issued a memo last year about this, saying those clauses are invalid in the contracts because they run contrary to the Anti-Deficiency Act, saying that the government can't be subject to open-ended liability because it's a fiscal law issue. So that provision can't be in the contract. You got to strike it. And if it's in there, it's null and void. So those are some of the issues you have to worry about. The big issue, security. And you really have to vet the security issue with your security team. That's my big advice. My best advice I can give you is go to your security folks. Okay? If you're going to bring open source software into the system, go to the security people. And then on the Forge.mil project, Forge.mil I think is a perfect example of an open source like model. And we've won awards for that within the community. But we've also had people say, well, that's not really open source like because you limit it to DoD employees and folks with a CAT card, DoD contractors. And we do that because some of the software is created by our vendors. Our vendors may still own the rights to it. They're concerned about their competitors getting a hold of that software. So it's sort of an open source-like model, and I think it's the best we could do with our security constraints and also the fact that we had contractors who were concerned about their competitors. They wanted to participate in this, but concerned about opening up this software to everybody. So I think that's a model of how you can create an open source type solution. If you want more information on Forge.mil, you can go to our website, and there's lots of information about that. I've had lots of federal agencies call me saying, can you put me in contact with the manager of that program, because I want to see how they set that up and what the issues were. So thank you very much. I appreciate you guys inviting a lawyer to take part in this, because I think we play a very valuable role in this, and these issues are very significant for federal agencies. Thank you.
Well, and frankly, Vicki, I want to thank you for being a government lawyer who's willing to come out and talk. Because frankly, as I said last year, we had the first year we did this, we couldn't find any government lawyers that would show up. So we're very grateful for having you here. Alec, if you want to step up, this is, let's see, find something pretty to put up here.
Maybe just the vignette you had on screen earlier.
Oh, okay, we can do that. Alec Permison is with Census.gov. He's an applications manager. And we're actually, I mean, unless you want to do it standing
maybe
first.
do this by standing up and sit down.
All right, let me bring the vignette up if I can figure out how to get there. Does anyone else think this is my first time using a computer? I'm just curious.
Stick to the jazz.
So here's the idea. Engaging America, the open source opportunity at the Census Bureau.
Sounds pretty good, right?
It sounds great.
All right, thank you. So my name's Alec Permison, and as Wayne mentioned, I'm an applications manager at the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm a technical manager for the web and mobile apps that we build, and increasingly the web APIs. And my partner in crime is actually Logan Powell, who's sitting right over here and helped organize this event. Between Logan and I, our job is to disrupt the traditional way that Census Bureau has been building stuff and try and give our senior management the occasional heart attack about the things that we're suggesting that they ought to be trying. So we have a lot of fun doing that kind of stuff.
And is it true you're doing that today?
If they knew I was here. Yeah, so the live stream is going to be great when my boss finds out. So before I start, I wanted to tell a brief story about my first introduction to the open source community. This goes back to sometime in the late 90s. And it was after college, and I'd found a room that I could rent. This was in Cambridge, and if you find a room that you can rent in Cambridge, you have to grab it. It's like a parking spot in DC. You don't waste any time. You don't ask how much. You say, I want it. Then you show up and see who your roommates are going to be. So I did that, and the roommates, they looked decent. You know, there's two of them. I got a little room in the corner. I can't remember how much it was. There was only one restriction, and the one restriction was that after 10 o'clock, you could not use the telephone. And I said, okay, I'll take it. I don't have any other options. So I was there a couple months, and things were going fine. The roommates were out. Maybe it was Saturday night. I was sitting there doing my homework, whatever. And I thought, they're not home. Really? I can't use the telephone after 10 o'clock? What could go wrong? So I'm just going to make a call, pick up the phone. It's a little funny sound on the phone. Hung up, got a good dial tone, started dialing. I had just finished dialing. There's a knock on my bedroom door. And I'm like, what is going on? This is like this kind of stuff, right? So I hang up the phone, I open the door, and there's this kind of disgruntled looking guy standing there in his like sweats and t-shirt. I'd never seen this guy before, and I was like, who are you? He's like, oh, I'm the fourth roommate. And I was like, what's going on? He's like, after 10 o'clock, I'm dialed in hacking the Linux kernel. So I was like, oh, so I just messed up like a whole day's worth of work for you. But fortunately, he started at 10, so it wasn't too bad. But that's why I realized that there are actually these people out there who spend a lot of their time, their evenings, contributing to this open source community. And I never knew about him, never saw him until in that particular moment. So fast forward like 10 or 15 years, and I hope to meet more of these folks as we're working to extend our applications at the Census Bureau out to the community. To start with, I wanted to give you just a little bit of background about how Census works. Everybody knows the Census Bureau, as we do that survey every 10 years, we come knock on your door. And I always get that theme song from Three's Company in my head, like come and knock on our door, we'll be waiting for you. So I kind of think about that as like what the Census Bureau does. Has anybody been out to the Census Bureau headquarters? Anybody here? Okay, yeah, you're not missing a lot. But it's a kind of cool building. It looks like a spaceship kind of landed in the middle of Suitland. It's got these really funky architecture. Actually, I think it's one of the coolest looking government buildings. I had been there about a year when I went around to the back side of the building. And on the back side of the building, there's this cute little house that's sitting next to this big spaceship kind of building. And I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe that's where the director lives, you know? Who knows what hangs out there? Well, what they told me was that was where they, somebody told me that's where they practice for the census. So they practice like knocking on the door and saying, hi, we'd like to get some information from you. And I was thinking to myself, you know, I think 2020 is not going to work quite like that, at least if I have anything to say about it. So anyway, that's kind of what we're known for. What we're really good at is once we get that information, we really kick it into high gear in terms of the analytics. I don't have an actual fact for you, which would drive those statistical people crazy, but it's my suspicion that we probably have amongst the highest density of mathematical statisticians per cubicle in the Washington, D.C. area. So we're really excellent at crunching numbers. The final part of this process, though, after we've collected the information, we've done the number crunching, is to put it back out there. And historically, this is kind of where we're awful. The traditional thing was we take the number set, we put it up on the FTP server, and then we go back and get a beer, and maybe we go hang out in that little house and play pool in the basement or something. But that was it. Over the past couple years, the direction the Census Bureau has been going is to make that data more accessible to the other 99% of the population that doesn't have a PhD in whatever it is, but kind of wonders, what can the Census Bureau do for me? And it turns out we have a lot of really interesting information. We have information about demographics, about the economy. We turn out to be the largest producer of economic indicators of all the statistical agencies, which I didn't know before. So we're working on providing that information in a way that relates to the layperson. We built an app called America's Economy. It's a mobile app that runs on your iPhone, your iPad, Android, et cetera, with BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and Census Bureau working together, produce this application. And you can basically get the unemployment rate, the producer price index, consumer price index, non-farm payroll, all these numbers that really describe our economy that you will read about on the front page of a newspaper, that you'll hear about on the radio, you can now get in our app. And that's the kind of accessibility that we want to provide for our data. That's what our digital transformation project is about. That's how Logan and I ended up in a government agency, working on that kind of stuff. Now, how does this relate to open source? Well, it turns out that the Census Bureau has a long tradition of using open source software. I mentioned Linux. It runs our web servers. Apache, of course, is the actual web server on top of the Linux operating system. The MySQL database someone mentioned. The PHP programming language. We also use a lot of Perl. So we've been a great consumer of that. But what we have not been so much is a producer. In other words, we've been kind of greedy. We've sat there and taken advantage of the stuff that guy back in 1997 was putting his heart and soul into for many years. But what did we give back for all the things that we've consumed? So Logan and I were thinking about this in our digital transformation project. We're like, you know, maybe we can do something a little bit better. The federal model is often that someone gets some funding, they write a check to a contractor, the contractor goes out and builds it, and they hand it back to you. And, you know, that works. We build some good stuff that way, but we could probably do better. And our first thought was, what should we build? I mean, it's cool that some executive had an idea, and I'm sure it was a good idea, but it's not the only idea. So we did something called a Visathon, which was we opened up the conceptualization of the app to the community at large. It's mostly the Census Bureau community, but it's actually accessible to anybody who goes to our website and said, hey, what would you like us to build with our data? And people could vote on that using idea scale. And the top idea was to map the population that's vulnerable to things like natural disasters. I know it has something to do with the tornadoes, earthquakes, firestorms, floods, and everything else that seems to hit us around here. So we thought that's a great thing to put on a map, and we can use data that we have about the population, and we can start to see which areas would be difficult to evacuate, and that could be useful in disaster planning. So that was a unique approach to coming up with an idea of what should be built. But then it came to how we build it. And my feeling was in a building with 5,000 or 6,000 people or more, there are going to be some good developers out there, and they're not going to be just the ones that work for me. So what if we just went downstairs, we have this nice big space, invited everybody who likes to write code, and said, hey, for a day we're going to try and build this thing. We have that idea, let's build it. So we took an agile approach. We had 28 people in the room at the same time. It was kind of crazy. But at the end of the day, we had a bunch of different pieces that we could put together, and we actually had a functioning app. So that was a whole different approach to how you could build software within a government agency, and turns out to be really fast and really cheap. The remaining piece of the puzzle then becomes, now that we've built that application, what do we do with it? I would love for my boss to say, okay, take the next 6 months and just work on that. All those other projects, you forget about those. But it doesn't really work like that. So our thought was, is there a way to take the work that we've done and open it up so other folks out there who might want to build on that, they might be in another government agency, they might be in the private sector, they might be just at home and think it's a cool idea, could take the work that we've started and build on that. And that's really what brings us here today, is find out what's the best approach to doing that. And I just want to post a couple of general questions that the experts then can follow up on as we're talking. The first is kind of a prosaic question of where do you put it? I mean, I know it's not a shoebox on the street corner, but if you just plop it out there, as someone mentioned, it almost might be the same effect. So how do you get it out there so it's accessible to people and they can start using it? The second one, the security and legal concerns we run into. We go and talk to our security department, and I mentioned GitHub. I was putting together a memo for the CIO about how we're going to use GitHub to host this during the event. And this is kind of an apocryphal story, but someone said, so let me get this straight. You're going to take your source code, and you're going to put it on this GitHub thing and put it out there on the internet. Now, have you stopped and thought about it? What would happen if this GitHub thing got hacked? And I thought, well, I think what would happen if the GitHub thingy, got hacked is that they would get our source code, which is, I think, the purpose. So I'm not sure how you handle that one, but I'm sure we'll get a lot of good advice on the security part of it. And then the final question is a positive question looking forward. Once we've started a community, once we've got a few people who've started to contribute, what is the proper way to govern that? You know, I like the benevolent dictator. I like to think that that's how my employees think of me. In that I don't want to get too involved in your code. If it's pretty much going well, I want to know that somebody reviewed it, not necessarily me, but we have a good process, we have a good environment, so it's self-sustaining. And that is kind of, I think, what we want to get to with the community, but I'm not sure how much oversight it needs, how much cultivating, where you draw the line in the governance of that. So that's something that I'm looking forward to finding out. So I figure we can start with the Codathon app, see how that goes. This looks like a pretty robust panel, so if that's too easy for you guys, I brought a more difficult business case that we can try addressing. And I don't want to get fired, but I mentioned that mobile application, America's Economy. I don't want to suggest that we would do anything with that app, but suppose we built a different app that also had 100,000 downloads, or just about, that was also multi-agency and so forth. It'd be interesting to see how you could approach taking an application like that and open sourcing it. I want to tell you, and I'll tell you about a couple of the challenges in building it that would have to be navigated if we were to make that something that a community would continue to build. So those are my questions, and then I'll sit down and start getting some answers.
Well, let me just sort of, as introduction, say I think we should focus on the simpler test case first.
Okay.
See how that goes. I noticed that, and I frankly want to say this as a thank you, that there were some really excellent notes taken during the presentations by the people in the audience, and that also you included some questions. And I obviously haven't seen what's in the hackpad here in about 15 minutes, but those questions will make excellent discussions during the breakout sessions. So feel free to move those down, find a room. I didn't really cover this, but the B200 rooms are through this door or down the stairs out back. The B100 rooms are basically at the top. The lobby is where you came in. And then there are rooms on the third floor also, which we actually have to get swiped in the elevator in order to get up to. So we want to start with the ones that are down here. All the rooms have technology in them, so if we want to, you want to pull in the internet, you want to show off things, whatever it is, that's all easy. So go ahead and fill those in, and when we get done with this discussion, we'll talk about where to go and how to break out for that. But first of all, I want to throw at the experts. Alec has given some really good information here. Starting with, what questions do you have to actually understand his situation? Maybe things he alluded to that he didn't go in enough depth in, that sort of thing. If you push the button on the little beeping thing here, the light should turn green.
Can you talk a little more about what the software, what the product is, and what
I think we're not getting, let's see.
Hello? Test 1 2. Test 1 2.
My question was, can you talk a little more about the software, what it is, what it will accomplish, what the goal is, and how you want the community to engage and do what with it, and do you want all of those enhancements back, or do you want it to be shared globally? And the reason I'm asking you these questions is because this is the discussion we had when we did the OSEMAS applications that I talked about earlier.
Okay. We wanted to do everything. So, so the application initially, it's a map-based visualization. It's using Google Maps, and it plots out a vulnerable population. So the idea is you can drill down to a census tract level, which is kind of like a big neighborhood. You might think of it that way. And we started with one variable, which was the elderly population over the age of 75, and we'll show you at 4 different levels the density of that population. So when you find a neighborhood, you can identify, or a region, you can say, okay, this area in the northwest of the city would be difficult to evacuate in the case of a flood because you have a lot of old folks living there. So that's the start, and it's a LAMP-based application, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP on the back end, a lot of JavaScript, various JavaScript libraries, which, if we talk about libraries, can be an interesting thing to look at because they're obviously open source libraries and different licenses on those. But what we want to do is extend it. One variable is a good start. There are many more variables that could be added to it that could make it more interesting. Our next thought is that it doesn't have to be just a web app. It could be a mobile app. It's easy to convert it into a mobile app. And then even more interesting, it could be a mashup with other stuff that already exists. So you can imagine NOAA has some kind of weather-based thing. They'd like to link to what we've got. But also I would say that we haven't imagined what all the possibilities are. There was the National Day of Civic Hacking, which Logan could talk about a little bit more, but basically it was external groups taking our data set and other data sets, many agencies and organizations participated, and seeing what they could do with it. And the coolest thing that came out of that was someone took income data and hooked up a 3D printer to it. And they produced a 3D visualization of income inequality. And it's just really interesting because you can see, like, it looks like a skyscraper next to like a tiny little house. And you just see how the differences in income are so close to each other. So stuff like that you really just, you didn't even think of it and somebody else thought of it, that's really like another thing that we're looking for, that innovation that we couldn't tell you what it is, but we'll kind of know it when we see it. So that's kind of what we're looking for. I forgot some of the other questions that...
Do you care if it's commercialized? Do you care if it's, say, a private company enhances it and then takes and commercializes it? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So the question is, do we care if it's commercialized? If a private company were to take this application that we've created and turn it into something more impressive? Well, the first example of that is actually Google Maps, which started with census data. And I think that's been a boon to everybody. Esri is another company that does a lot of mapping that also grew out of census. So I think there's a tradition of that happening. I think it would be great. I mean, that's my feeling about it.
Just a sub-question regarding the raw data and the accessibility to those. To what extent have you advertised that, and to what extent do you think that people are aware of the availability of those data, and how do you plan to go for that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we built this using our public API, and that's part of the federal digital strategy, to have an API that gets all your data out there. And so we're eating our own dog food, trying to build our apps more and more off of that API instead of off of private databases. So how well that's been publicized, I know there's a lot of work that's been done to publicize it. The National Day of Civic Hacking did that. We have a developers page. There's an ongoing developers community that's maintained. The communications director works on maintaining that. So there is a certain amount of outreach, and that's one place that I think we might start with this. But definitely we have an API that can be leveraged and that we're also continuing to extend. So a lot of the story is ultimately that census is not about building apps. We're almost more of a data platform. And that's really our future, is that we can collect, analyze, and disseminate the data, and other people can build all the cool apps that work off of it.
No, I was just wondering how much of the application affects what the other side of the API is. Or, I mean, is it designed such that the API is extensive enough that you don't need to feed a lot of stuff back? Or I'm trying to think if that's how self-contained the application is itself. and whether there's enough fun to go on there, or whether to do really, really neat stuff, things need to be pushed back to the API, which would cause some delay or concerns or stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one thing we found in working off the API is our first approach at an API was really get all the data out there. So it's like this massive fire hose that you can get all these different data sets, but it's really structured for an internal kind of user. So you have to dig through a massive PDF file to start to figure out the variables and the tables. Along with that, if you're building a lightweight web app or a mobile app, you don't necessarily want to do a call and get a huge dump of data. You have to filter that down. So we ended up with this application with others building basically like a private API that serves the app. It pulls that big chunk of data, so we know it's current accurate, but then only sends a small payload to the application itself. So right now we're using that approach, and that also means that we don't have to modify that public API, so we can just work with that. I expect that at least in the initial iterations of the app, you would continue to have that kind of approach, so you do have a back end to the app that if you're putting the software out there, you would have to continue to grow until we've got to the next version of our API, maybe, or I'm not sure. But there's definitely a back end to the application.
Okay.
The experts are full of questions, but
I'm waiting for the answer.
So back to your point about being the data source only and not the application development, to what extent do you think that you're ready to devote resources towards kickstarting or even facilitating a development hub or like a framework and an ecosystem around development of those applications? Are you ready to do that, or you think that that's something that needs to be done somewhere else?
Well, so speaking for my group, I have a bunch of developers that have built various applications, and we have gotten to a shared library and approach. So one thing that we would love to do is put that out there as here's our first attempt at giving you a framework almost, or a software development kit to access our API. And then we understand that might not be the best approach, but it's a good start. So we have some stuff in-house that we could start to provide to the community as a starting point for that. That would make sense. But I don't know that we've done that in any formal way. So I don't think that our API comes with much beyond some basic documentation, and you can start hitting it with some calls.
I was just wondering how many people who were in the Codathon would be are eager to see the software out there and would be willing to continue doing the work either on or off business hours.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a survey afterwards, and all the respondents to the survey said they would definitely want to do it again. So everyone had a lot of fun. They liked that they all felt they were part of one team, which doesn't always happen in a big agency. That gets kind of siloed out, so that was cool. They liked the idea that at the end of the day you could see your work, and sometimes it's many months before you actually get to see it. So I do think we have a good starting point, as you're suggesting there, to draw upon of people who would want to contribute some time to take it to the next level. There is always, I think, in government a question of how do I know you're doing your work and you're not doing that fun, cool project? We don't really have 20% time like Google does. So are you doing it in your after hours? And if you're doing it in after hours, is it still covered under the government license, or is it somehow messed things up there? So there's probably our lawyer can talk to those questions.
Exactly.
How many of the people who were doing that have also worked in external open source projects? Do you have a feel for that? Because, and the reason why I'm saying is because the exposure is different. If you're a developer inside of the census or whatever, the people who are able to look at what you're doing is necessarily smaller. Once you put it out on GitHub or SourceForge or something like that, everybody gets to see it. And some developers may not be comfortable with with that. They're going to feel as if I got to make sure I put out my best work,
right.
And it might stop their workflow or change their workflow a little bit.
Right. My sense is that we don't have any experienced open source developers who've actually contributed to the community. We have a lot of people who leverage the stuff that's out there but haven't really had a chance to put stuff out there. We have one person who's published some articles. Somebody else had written a book on ActionScript or something like that. So we have some expert level skills, but nobody who is like a regular contributor to Apache or something like that.
I think the issue you're getting at when you think about models to put it out there really gets at a resource issue. And that's what happened with us at DISA, in both the OSEMAS project and in the Forge.mil project. In the Forge.mil project, we actually manage that in-house within DISA, but we have a manager, we have a full team of people, because you have hundreds and hundreds of DoD employees and contractors, and also software that's been created for us. And so managing that, and if you go to Forge.mil's website, you'll see that managing that it's pretty timely, it's pretty resource intensive, and so we have a full team who manages that. That's their job. That's what they do. Now, on the OSEMAS project, that's why we decided to put that software out via a technology transfer model, which I'll be honest with you, at the time was kind of a unique way to go, but I mean, it's the ultimate kind of tech transfer. You take something that's been created within the government, you want to share it with private sector, academia, nonprofits, and you want them to be able to enhance it. Well, we knew that we didn't have the resources in-house to manage putting it out there, because we put it out really sort of worldwide. I mean, it's out there kind of globally. And so what we did was we looked for an organization that had the kind of experience in doing that also had worked with the Department of Defense. And the open source software group down in Mississippi had done some Navy projects. And so they were familiar with the defense lingo, they were familiar with how it all worked within defense, and so we partnered with them to put it out there. Now, they actually manage that and the agreement that we structure is really a classic sort of technology transfer agreement. All of those enhancements to that code come back to us, but they manage it all, because there's just no way we'd have the staff in-house to be able to do that. I think NASA has put some of their stuff out via an open source software model, and they have their own license, I think, and there have been some questions about that. We'll leave that off the discussion plate. But yeah, they did. Okay, good. That's good to hear that. Okay, but they do, and I think they manage theirs in house. I don't think they have a team outside that does that. But you really kind of have to look at sort of the resources involved in doing that. And I think you raise an excellent question when you say, can they do it at home during their off work hours, and are there copyright issues? And yes, because it's not done within, the question is, it's not done within the scope of their official duties during the day. Would the developer, the employee, then own the copyright in it? And that, sorting all of that out, there might be some other sort of personnel related issues, because you would be doing work off of your regular work schedule. So those kinds of issues you would definitely have to vet. But when we started doing the analysis, we looked at what we were trying to accomplish. We wanted to get it out there as much as, especially the OSEMAS thing, the Forge.mil, we wanted to get that out there, but to a much more limited audience. And that raised a number of issues because of the software that we had. Some of it was really private stuff, and they were willing to share it with DoD, within DoD. And if you look at Forge.mil has Software Forge and then Project Forge, and one of those is more open, the other one is more restricted, and the company actually looks at who can enter. So they have tight access controls on who can get into that site and get to the code, because the last thing they want is their competitor to get to the code, take it, enhance it, and then go out and commercialize it and compete with them. Right. So it was complicated to set up Forge.mil, very complicated, and that's an in-house managed program. So you just have to kind of see what your resources are.
Limited.
Limited, right. Will your seniors buy into it? That's the other thing.
So that's the question. Like, the Codathon, kind of the interesting thing is that we could build something really fast and really cheap. Right. But then I hate to go back and say, and now it's going to cost you a whole bunch of money to take it to the next level. So I wonder, what have you seen as the most resource efficient way to get something out there?
Yep.
I'll be honest with you. I think for us, the OSEMAS model, because that's a tech transfer agreement, no money exchanged hands. We're not paying this company or this nonprofit. It's a nonprofit organization. That's the first thing to say. They're not making money. We're not paying them to manage this for us. They're doing it because they really want the government to be involved in open source software. They want to get it out there.
Okay, cool.
And so for them, it's the mission. It's all about the mission for them.
Right.
So they were willing to work with us. No payment, and this agreement is for a 5-year term, so it's pretty limited, but we could certainly decide to revise it and amend it and extend it if we wanted to. Right. But no money is exchanging hands.
Okay.
And
sounds good.
It's not a lot of resources on our side, other than our developers who would normally be working this code anyway. When they make changes to it, they just hand those changes over to them, and they make those changes and they give it back to us.
And Jim, if I could ask you to expand on this a little bit.
Sure.
in Alec's original question, he said, where do you host the code?
Right.
And obviously Apache is one of the options. I don't know who the organization is that you're referring to, but obviously there's a number out there.
Yeah. In fact, I was going to ask one question and then make some recommendations because I know we're waiting for some recommendations. My question is, has anyone ever said that you remind them of Tom Kenny? Who's the voice of SpongeBob SquarePants, and he was on Mr. Show on HBO. If you have a chance,
I knew something
Google
like that
Tom
would
Kenny.
happen if you did this for him.
What I'd like to recommend is that there are, a number of existing, foundations out there. Some with much tighter ties to government agencies, and much with, tighter ties to pure open source entities out there. The ASF is a great place, but the problem with the ASF is that they really don't handhold new projects as they come on board. There is an incubation process. Excuse me? That's the Apache Software Foundation, yes. That's the reason why I would consider the other entity organized with, it's called the Outer Curve Foundation, and what they focus on is the actual governance community, the mentoring process of how you take an existing code base and build a community up around that. There are a lot of people that we have, and it's a nonprofit entity. There's no money exchanging right there. And the nice thing also about that is that it enables you to pick any place for your source code repository. If you want to go GitHub, that's fine. If you want to go SourceForge, it makes no restrictions as far as the licensing is concerned itself. It's really there to provide basically the contracts and expertise and stuff like that for things like IP clearance and things like that, and to provide the expertise to enable you to grow a community out there. So that might be, maybe we can offline talk about that. That might be a really, really good fit.
One point regarding the resources, and that was raised, how many resources do you need in order to open source something that is developed internally or to kickstart something new? Open sourcing something or kickstarting a new open source community doesn't necessarily mean that you need added resources to the ones that you already have. And this is because some people, let's say X number of people within Census Bureau, are already dedicated to developing some applications for public consumption of the data, right? So those people with a community coming in, a tenfold in terms of scale, community coming in based on the people that you already have, can take some senior managerial positions on project management and community building around those specific projects. So they can be transformed from the ones actually writing the code to the ones having more senior level and more senior role in the development of the code. So you can keep the same resources and still have like a huge impact when you're deploying a community. And this is true especially for cases that you open source something that it's already deployed and you have already existing resources on developing things inside the Bureau. So.
And one final point, I know that it's being changed now, but there was a tendency years ago for the government to try to come up with their own licenses. Okay, definitely make sure that you use an OSI-approved license. Don't go off on your own. That really is very, very restrictive as far as trying to build and bring in community and stuff like that.
In fact, I can, actually, that's a really good point, because when we did our OSSI project, I looked at developing our own license, and it was too complicated to do. We probably wouldn't have been approved. I mean, all of that, the approval process, and so we used one of those licenses. You're absolutely right.
And having done this 3 years in a row, the first open source summit, there was a lot of discussion around NOSA, which is NASA's open source agreement. And I think they ran into the same thing, that when they released it in, 96, something like that, it was very cutting edge and very forward thinking. But today there's like 13 basic licenses. And if you're not using one of those licenses, developers, they don't want to read a new license. They don't want to learn it. They'll go, oh, don't know what that is, not working on that project.
Right. And especially companies will touch that as well.
Yeah. What I wanted to bring into this discussion is that I think there's kind of two things that are being, that you're looking for here. One is, how do you build a community around an open source software project, but also around your API? And maybe even building the community around the API, not specifically focusing on the software, is even more valuable for where you're at. So I just want to throw that out because I was hearing that.
And the answer is?
So, with regards with the API, you're basically saying about the facilitation of the API, like the development behind the servers running the API and serving all those data, right? Not the consumption part of it.
Oh, I think we're talking about the consumption part of it.
The consumption part of it. So the consumption part of it, you're looking into developing an ecosystem of developers and kickstarting it out there. I think that there are organizations that have like random kinds of hacks of kindness and other organizations that are focused on and have extensive experience, especially people from NASA, on deploying like a large set of events around the country or abroad, so they can help you like kickstart the same way that you did the Visathon internally. That can be exported on many different locations, so you can come up with much more like a multiplication of results around those things. So based on that, then you'll be able to have like a much more broader view of what is possible. Right. So you can choose from those and see how this goes. I think that the main point that you should look into is try to define the audience. Like, who are you looking into bringing in? Are you looking only for front-end developers that are going to help you, consume the data better, or are you looking into, I don't know, like back-end code developers, or are you looking into agencies that might be able to reuse your data? So those are contributors too, right? So defining the audience would be the first part.
Another thing I would I think I heard you earlier said that you had like a developer framework regarding the API.
For the applications that we've developed, we've put together an in-house kind of framework.
Right.
It's a set of libraries that's evolving into a framework.
Yeah,
Conventions and so forth.
I definitely think that you should consider also releasing that out as much as possible,
okay,
because developers love tools. Okay, so if their only exposure to an API is like a single application that interfaces with the API one way, you're not going to get that much involvement with it. So if there's, things that developers can play with to exercise that API, to figure out what's going on with the API, that's going to be much more, they're going to get a lot more involved in that. They're going to figure out ways of using and leveraging that API more, rather than just saying, okay, well, this is what it's doing, that might be all it's able to do.
Right, that makes sense. So a question that comes up for each of the applications we build, security reviews them. They have a risk profile that's basically a tailored set of controls from NIST that applies to applications. And one thing we've noticed is that, like with mobile applications, the framework kind of focuses on enterprise applications. So they wanted us to have a warning banner on the mobile app when it launched. We're like, well, that's probably not going to be good for users. It's like you're entering government property. Right. So I think the same thing will start to come up as when we want to put like our code out there. We have some libraries. We say, hey, we want to work with this organization and start to publish this out there. I'm sure there's going to be some security concerns or whatever. And is that something that we work with the organization to help get through, or?
Do you have a security team in-house?
Yeah.
Because that's what we had to do first. We worked with the security team in-house and had them sort of vet all of the issues. And so they did a little checklist for us in terms of putting it out there, what it was going to mean for the agency, what the issues were. So we worked through the issues in-house. And then when we found the organization down in Mississippi, their first question was, have you all vetted the security issues? And we said yes. And so that really was our responsibility, the agency's responsibility. So I think you have to work very closely with your team. And they've got to look at federal laws and policies in terms of the security issues, right? Some of the stuff is controls from NIST, sort of the standards, whether you've met that. FISMA, if there are issues there. So you got to do it in-house first. And then if there's something in terms of the organization that you end up with, sort of putting it out there, and they have their own security team, well, they'll work together, but you will have done your in-house vetting first.
Okay.
So, one question for clarification regarding the security issues. If the API is already available to everyone and the data is there, even to some extent like the drill down of those data, what is the security issue with the usage of those? I mean, people can access the API as it is right now, right? So your worry would be the security concerns about the drill down of information, or?
The security concern is really, for an internal app, it's how you build it, your process for building it, that you're not accidentally releasing non-public data with it. There's a lot of things that they're looking at. Now, when we make the point that if we're building an app that uses the API, then that should be less of a concern.
Yes.
So they can tailor out those controls. But any application that we build still has to go through a certification process. It'll be interesting to see when we say that this application is not only going to be used by the public, but perhaps built by the public, what additional security things that brings up.
And I think for you guys, the data that you're putting out there is a huge issue, because some of that could be personal information that you're putting out, if it's location or addresses. How do you handle that?
So basically, we're only putting out aggregate data to start with.
Okay.
And then when you get down to a small enough level, they introduce basically fuzz in the data.
Okay.
So you could never figure out an individual based on if I knew something about them, I could figure out who that was.
Okay.
So they're already kind of handling that aspect. And we have a long tradition of doing that before we publish the data.
Right.
The difference now is just how you're accessing the data via the API, making a RESTful call as opposed to downloading a data set.
Yeah, I think another thing to consider is that as you expose that API to the world, you're going to really hit performance and scalability concerns. Yeah. Because as you said, especially if they're on mobile devices and stuff like that, and that also would be a fun thing for developers to help out with. Is that because that's fun stuff. It's the kind of stuff that really interests people. So if there was some sort of avenue or mechanism to allow them to also provide feedback or insight into scalability or things like that, that might be good. And I just have a question for Vicki. Is the place in Mississippi, is that OSSI, John Weathersby? Yes. Okay.
And so you were talking about mailing lists. We have like a discussion forum, which I think is similar to that approach. Is that the kind of place that you're talking about, that developers would give feedback on how the API is working for them and what they might recommend changing and so forth? Right. Okay.
Yeah. And things like bug trackers and things like that, Jira or Bugzilla or something like that, is just another avenue for people to put in enhancement requests or issues that they pop up.
That's a great idea. So we use Jira internally. But we could be using some similar kind of tool, Bugzilla, whatever, to track all the suggestions so that people would actually see that it's been captured, maybe it's being worked on or something like that.
Cool. The more that you can be transparent.
Right.
Yeah,
right. So I guess another question I have, if I were to go back to my CIO and say, okay, went to this thing, they have a great ideas, here's what, all I need is some time from security, a little bit here and there. What is the payoff? Like, he's always about the business side of things. What is the path for participating in the community? And I can see a bunch of things, but what really speaks to the government executives in your experience that this is a project worth supporting and investing in? So even if it's 20% of our time, what have you, any nuggets of wisdom?
Actually, for us, excellent question. We did a white paper. And we did a white paper for the seniors, and it was something short that basically said, here's the agency's mission. This is how this fits into the mission. And of course, when we started doing this, DoD was all about sort of going enterprise. Everything was enterprise-wise. You do everything for not only DISA, but for the entire DoD complex. Right. And so because this allowed everybody to be able to share in on the software that all of DoD components could use, they saw the value in it, because that was sort of where we were going as an agency. So I think if you can match up what you're trying to do to where the agency's strategic goals are, especially now and at this time, I think budget costs, anything, if you can show how this helps efficiency, cost cutting, development, if you can tie that in to your project, then you probably get buy-in.
For me, I think, the way to approach it would be, as a citizen, I see the value of the census as the creation of the data that you're providing. That's really the benefit. That's really what we're getting, is just all this huge amount of data out there. But as a citizen, I wouldn't be able to have access to that data. It's being collected on all of our behalves. We all want to be able to exercise it and view it. So I think being able to create an open source project which makes it easier for the citizens to have access to that data, query the data, and things like that, it makes it much more personal. that the census is no longer this external entity who divvies out information to us as it sees fit. This is information that we work with the census, and it makes it much more of a, not every 10 years, but it's continual. And I think it creates that sense of ownership of that data because you're owning it and you're using the data.
I have this sense that census data by itself is not all that interesting. We'll just let that sit for a minute. I say that because I think where it becomes interesting is when it's mixed with FEMA data, or it's mixed with weather data, or it's mixed with... It is a foundation on which so many things could be done. Right. And that is really what you're trying to get at, is that if the API... You can build a community around it. The API is so easy, anyone can use it, that suddenly even existing open source projects can go, oh, you know what? That actually fleshes out this entire thing that didn't exist before. And so I bring this up because I'm curious more from the software developer community building perspective. How do you find communities that already exist that they can just plug into, take their data to, instead of trying to do their own set of hackathons all over the globe? How do they find things that are already going on that they can plug into to get some, to grow them?
So, do you want to get me started with it?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to, certainly going to conferences, like this, are very, very important. But I also think going to, I see that Hortonworks, for example, is one of the sponsors here. I mean, big data is huge now, and I can't think of much bigger data than census, data. And so, and as I said before, I mean, and I hate to harp on it, but for open source to work, there needs to be that enthusiasm by developers. And so when you go to, if you were to go to these big data conferences, you're seeing people who are just looking for all kinds of big data to crunch. What are the problem sets associated with that? And so, really making sure that they're engaged, that they're aware that this type of data might be, being made available for people. I think that would really encourage, you would, have not only access to the developers who'd be interested in working with it, but also being able to put you in touch with other people who are dealing with other big data sets and possible collaboration between those.
Right. Yeah, I really like the idea that we find a community that can really use it and just plug into it like you're talking about. Some folks have talked about what if there were a jQuery plugin or a Drupal plugin that would make it easy just to access all of our data sets. Do you guys think that that's the kind of thing that's worthwhile necessarily? Or is
that will definitely help the developers, have like an easy kickstart, like be able to hack as fast as possible and as seamless as possible with your API, and that makes total sense. Especially if it could be like a WordPress plugin, a Drupal plugin, even Django app to directly fetch things, or jQuery plugin, you name it. So basically, it's posing yourself as a resource more than someone that develops the data itself. So be a resource and be available to the developers as much as possible. So that would be open source conferences, all the places that the big data discussions are happening right now, and there are plenty of them. Like there are conferences literally every month around US about that. So I would say at least creating something like a toolkit on how you can easily and a showcase examples of how you can easily, hook things together, right. And especially showcasing the interconnectivity with other agencies and other data that you can, pull data together. So that could be easy hacks for you. Like there can be another Visathon of just, combining data, and you can publish those results, especially if they're based directly on the public API. You don't have any privacy issues on that. So you can publish something like examples of diverse, like connecting and interoperability between data sets, so that you can just present them on open source conferences, and people are going to just be excited about that.
I want to start wrapping up. Alec, first I want to give you the opportunity to ask one more question.
Oh, I think I only have one. Well, so one interesting thing that comes up, just to give you a sense, with the America's Economy mobile app that shows economic indicators, we had a lot of discussions around the symbols that go next to the indicators. An asterisk that says it's statistically significant, a circle that means it doesn't apply, There was a square, a triangle, and some other shapes I hadn't seen before that were suggested. And this really comes from a sense of data experts who say, if you're going to use my data, you got to be very careful and use it only in these specific ways. Obviously, once you have an API out there, we're saying do anything you want with it. So there's that inherent tension there. I definitely see with, at least with the app side of it, if we put an app out there that uses data in certain ways, the resistance that someone's going to use it the wrong way. And I understand that because people have spent their career using it the right way. But on the other hand, once you put something out in the wild, then you have to kind of step back and you can't quite control it. I don't know, what's a good answer to those kind of objections?
Yeah, one point regarding discoverability of those things. So if you have like you do right now, like a public API available to everyone, you can right next to it have a best practices and guidelines on from design principles to wording to like copyright to whatever is applicable to those applications. That's one thing. And then when you see something that is published out there based on your API and it's not following those guidelines, you should not advertise it back. So let me put it the other way around. If something is using your guidelines, you should promote it more and make it discoverable to everyone. Something like showcasing it within your website, within your communication channel, so you can amplify, the communication around that. Those are the things that we want. Those are the things that you should build upon.
Okay.
And I think just in any situation where you're doing information usage and security, and I sort of link those two things together when you put it out there, there's always a risk analysis that you do. And I think that's what you have to do is sort of weigh the benefits, the risk of putting this out there and the kinds of issues that this is going to raise, and then trying to figure out where the advantages stack up and whether those advantages put you in a place that outweigh the risk. But you're always going to have to do a risk analysis. Right. Yeah, and that's a good lawyerly answer, sorry, but I had to do that.
Last words, Jim? Nothing.
Regarding the question or
oh,
the panel?
No, for the panel.
Oh, for the panel. That's different.
Please.
I hope everyone's having fun and getting something out of all this.
Yeah, same hope about productivity and constructive.
I guess the only question I would have is if there's anything that you all could recommend from the government side or from the private sector side that we could be doing from the policy and legal side, putting out additional guidance, if there's anything that we could do that enhances so that people aren't afraid, especially within the government, to use open source software. If you would get that to me, then I can take that back to the Ascendi group that's working on the policies and or guidance more than policies. Okay.
And I will say, I see that you've been taking very good notes in the HackPad, so feel free to create a section for any things that the open source community needs from government lawyers. Can I say that? Vicky will solve all those problems.
I didn't go that far.
Oh, okay. Alex?
Disclaimer.
Last word?
Just that this has been a great opportunity. I really appreciate all the feedback. It's great to know that this has been done and there's a path forward and that we can just follow that. And I see a lot of possibilities, so thank you all. And also in the audience for attending. I'm looking forward to seeing the HackPad because I didn't take any notes here. So thank you.
It looks like you'll have your work cut out for you. Thank you.